everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the podcast. On this episode, we're going to be covering cheating, and we're actually going to cover it from the player's perspective rather than from the judge's perspective. Um, in most events, the judge to player ratio is 1 to 20. The 1 to 20 is a good target. You may have some events where it's even as low as 1 to 30. Hopefully, not any lower than that. But even in a 1 to 20 player to judge ratio, judges are going to be focusing or not able to focus on specific matches, generally speaking. You're going to be the front line of defense in terms of not being taken advantage of for cheating and bringing potential cheating to the judge's attention. They may be walking by a match. You may think they hear something or see something, but in all likelihood, they probably are going to miss the things that you're seeing because you have a focus on your match. You have a different perspective than what the judges do. They are having their attention drawn to more obvious issues, rulings, questions, so forth, and may not notice the things that you would notice in your match. Now, it's not to say that a judge can't see cheating going on. I know a number of judges, myself included, have observed players cheating in a large venue of players and have been able to pick out and DQ such a player for those actions. But to be honest, you're going to have a range of skill level of judges. Some are going to be relatively new judges, or just as I said, there's just so much going on they can't see or focus on what you can see. So to be perfectly frank, as the player, you're your best defense against being taken advantage of for cheating. So what I want to do today is give you some tips on how you can help prevent yourself being taken advantage of and cheating, or help your neighbors if you happen to see something. All right, let's go over a few things. Now, the other thing that I want to make note of here is that the vast majority of players you're going to encounter do not cheat. One of the really nice things about the Pokemon trading card game is that the player base is fantastic. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some players cheating out there. There's always someone cheating. It's a small percentage, but you don't want to be the victim of it. One of the other things to bear in mind is that recently Pokemon started offering cash prizes, much larger prizes available to players, and that's attracting a newer player base, players coming in from other games. So you want to make sure that you are aware of the kind of things to look out for and do the best you can to not fall victim yourself. Now, the first thing to note is that in a lot of cases, if somebody is good at cheating, you're not necessarily going to see them actually cheat if they're good at it. What you want to do is know how to stop the benefit of any potential cheating going on, even if you don't necessarily catch that cheating itself. Okay? So, for example, let's start with there's a number of areas where players can do things to cheat. So let's start with their deck. Okay? So number one thing that a player can do is have marked cards, and there's a variety of ways that cards can be marked. Now, you're not necessarily going to see the real minor things, and you're going to depend on judges doing deck checks to catch some of this. But some of the things you want to look out for are cards that are, say, bent. There's well known that there are some promo cards that have a bend to them, or there's various other cards that may be bendy. And if you see the player has their prizes laid out, and there are certain cards that look different than the other cards because they have a very distinct bend to them. That's an issue you want to raise to a judge, because you should not be able to see one card being more bent than the other. Or you may see the corner of a card, the corner of a sleeve, having a significant bend to it, and that may just be wear and tear, but if it's a very distinct bend, that might be something to either have a judge check, either during the match if you're really suspicious of it, or bring it to their attention after the match. That player can have a deck check called on them, and the judges can take a look at their deck afterwards. It may not help you in that particular round, but it certainly helps get that player out of the game if something shady is detected. Okay, so their deck, their actual physical deck, is the number one thing you can look for, things that don't look right. Okay? The number two thing that as a player you want to be aware of and keep an eye on your opponent is shuffling. So there's a number of different ways of shuffling, only two of which are good and mandated in the Pokemon rules. Riffle Shuffle and Mash or Smash Shuffle are both good ways, and my other podcast that I have on shuffling, I have a couple actually on shuffling, but the one that goes over the different ways of shuffling will, if you're not familiar with them, can show you what those ways are. But Riffle and Mash are good ways of shuffling that have a randomization, a high randomization after just a few shuffles, whereas shuffling like pile shuffling or Hindu shuffling, where you're taking groups of cards and pulling them out and moving them to the top or bottom of the deck, are very bad ways of shuffling. They maintain order or it can even impose order. So they may be, they are allowed as a way of shuffling as long as they are also followed up by Riffle and or Mash, because those are the ones that actually do the randomization. So number one, make sure your opponent is doing Riffle and Mash shuffling. Number two, keep an eye to make sure that the top or bottom card as they're shuffling changes. It's quite possible when somebody is shuffling for them to maintain a card that they want at the top of the deck, or maintain a card that they want at the bottom of the deck, and then at some point manipulate that card to a place where they want it. So be very aware that as they're shuffling, that those top cards or bottom cards are going into the mix and not maintaining position. This is especially important if they have just performed a search through their deck, where say they're looking for a specific type of card, but if someone's cheating, they could take another card that is not a valid target, position it to the bottom, and then maintain it there and have control of it. So there are a couple of things you can do after a player shuffles. Number one, I recommend that you always cut the opponent's deck after they shuffle. This is not a accusation of cheating. I cut my children's decks when I play with them. I try to teach them to do the same. You should just always cut regardless of who you're playing. Now, it's important here to vary where you cut, because if you always cut to the same place, if you are playing a cheater, they can take note of where you are always cutting to and position the card they want so that that comes to the top after you cut. So if you're sometimes cutting top, sometimes bottom, sometimes middle, always vary. And you, just to make sure you're aware, you have the option of, after your opponent shuffles, that you can perform a shuffle as well. And then afterwards they get a final cut. You don't necessarily want to shuffle after every time they shuffle, because obviously it eats up into game time. However, a good time to do that would be after they have performed a deck search and you've noticed them moving cards around. Now, those may have been potential targets of their search, and they may have chosen them, or they may have not chosen them and chosen some other card. But the fact that they have manipulated cards in their deck gives them now the opportunity, if they are cheating, to have arranged that card to go where they want it to. And so if you perform a shuffle yourself, that can destroy that possibility. So that's a real strong thing you can do to protect yourself. The number 3 thing that you can keep an eye on is your opponent's demeanor. If your opponent during their turn is paying more attention to where you're looking, or are there judges around, they're looking around, are they looking to see judges, they're not paying attention to what they're doing in their turn, that's an indication that they may be looking for opportunities. So keep an eye on that. That is a good indicator of potential shady behavior. It's not cheating in and of itself, but it's a red flag that should alert you that you want to keep an eye, especially at that moment, because if they're looking around to look for an opportunity at that moment, that may be a time where they are looking to do something, and so you want to pay special attention to what they are doing during that time period. Now, the number 4 thing you want to keep an eye on is when your opponent is moving cards from one zone to another. This is a tremendous opportunity for someone who is going to cheat to get access to a card that they shouldn't have access to. So one of the things you want to make sure your opponent is not doing is having their deck or discard pile in one hand and their playing hand in the other hand. They should never have those things near each other at the same time. If they do, you should immediately instruct them to put their hand down. If they want to go back and refer to their hand to see what's in it, to make sure they're searching for something and do they need this, do they need that, they want to check their hand, fine. But put the deck or discard down, pick up their hand separately, check what they want to check, put the hand down again, go back to where they're going. Having both in hands at the same time is a tremendous opportunity to get a card from one of those zones to the other without you being aware of it. Okay? So the best way to prevent that from happening is for that opportunity not to be there. Toward that end, when they are moving cards, when they're performing a search or pulling something out of the discard pile, keep a track of their card count in their hand. Ask them how many cards they have before their search. Once they've done their search and you know how many cards they should be getting, check again. It should match up. X plus 1 or 2, depending on how many cards they obtained in their search. If those numbers don't match up, call the judge immediately. So that's number 5. Now, number 6, cards fall on the floor. This could be innocent. What you want to do is, again, before they go to retrieve their cards, if you've been generally keeping track of card counts through the game, you want to make sure that they are obtaining back from the floor the correct number of cards that they started with. It's not that hard to drop a card from the discard pile so that it's on the floor, and now, oops, I dropped some cards from my hand, oh, let me go retrieve them, and now they've also retrieved this other card that they need. Basically, what you want to do is slow down the action at that point. You want to, before they go retrieve it, you want to make sure how many cards fell as best you can, and how many cards come back into their hand. If there was an important card that you are aware that they would love to get back from the discard pile, it's a great time to check the discard pile and make sure it's still in there. Okay, so that's number 6. Okay, for number 7, let's talk about damage on Pokemon. So there's a couple of things. One is the placing of damage when an attack is done, and maintaining that those damage counters stay where they're supposed to be throughout the game. Be aware if an opponent does an attack, or if you do an attack, have the damage called out, that they are, if you're doing damage to them, that the correct number has been applied. Keep track if there's multiple attacks doing multiple damage over turns onto a Pokemon, how much should that be now? Especially if a Pokemon is being moved from active to the bench, or if cards are being moved around on the bench for some reason, that keep track of how much damage should be on there, and that they don't get moved at that time. That's another opportunity for a player to tilt the dice, so it's gone from 3 pips to 1 pip. All right, just keep an eye on that. Number 8, drawing too many cards. This can happen accidentally a lot, so even if it's not cheating, you still want to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And there is a significant penalty now, of a double prize penalty now, in Tier 2 events. So whether it's cheating or not, this still carries a significant penalty to it, and it should, because the potential advantage from drawing extra cards obviously can be huge. Whether it's done intentionally or not, having that access to extra resources that they shouldn't have access to can make the difference between winning the game or losing the game. And as I said, whether it's cheating or not, you want to prevent it. So make sure if you're playing an N or some card that has the opponent draw a variable number of cards, that in fact they're not on autopilot and drawing a standard 6 cards when they should be drawing less. Alternately, for the cheater, make sure they're drawing in a way that you can see all the cards that they're drawing. Now, the best way for someone to draw is drawing one at a time, or taking a stack and dealing onto the table the number of cards they're going to draw, which is the way I favor to do it. It's the cards are laid out on the table, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or however many are being drawn, and then I scoop them up. The player can easily see what's been drawn. If your opponent is not doing that, they're drawing 3 cards at a time. Was it 3 cards? Was it 4 cards? Not the best way to draw. You can ask them to draw 1 card at a time, or if they are drawing multiples, ask them for a hand count at the end to show you the number of cards, to make sure that they have the right number for what they should have. Again, players should not be taking offense at opponents doing this. It's in everyone's advantage for everyone to be playing properly. So that's another thing that can be done. All right, the 9th area is going to be taking extra actions. There are a number of actions in the Pokemon game where you're limited to once per turn, playing a supporter once per turn, attaching 1 energy per turn, things like that. If a player can take a long turn doing numerous things, and let's say they've attached an energy at the beginning of their turn, and then they do a number of other things, it is not hard, either accidentally or on purpose, but again, in either case you want to prevent this, of playing a second energy, or using a second supporter, or using an ability that either they've already used or they're not able to use because of lock. There are various ways you're allowed to take notes. You can keep notes during the turn of when your opponent has taken these actions, and just a simple E for energy or S for supporter on the turn can note that they have done it, and therefore they shouldn't be doing it again. Or just basically, which is harder, maintaining track during the turn, or just maintaining, remembering what they're doing during the turn. That can be harder. Notes are better. It does not hurt to take notes, so that's a good way to protect yourself. And those notes can also help you later on in Number 10, calling a judge. This is the end all and be all of really protecting yourself at the end of the day. Players do not call judges over enough. I think some players worry about being that guy calling a judge on somebody doing something shady. But remember, you're not that guy. He's that guy. He's the one who's doing something shady that you're not sure what's going on, and you need to make sure that things are being done properly. Now, when you call a judge over, it's very important that you not advocate for a penalty. You want to state to the best of your knowledge what you observed happening. If you have suspicions, let the judge know your suspicions. If you thought you saw an extra card being drawn or that a card got taken from the discard pile, let the judge know what you think you saw, and that if you thought it was not accidental, that you thought it was not accidental. All of this will go toward evidence and the judge deciding what happened, and they're going to hear from the opponent as well. So if you're not a strong advocate for your position, and by strong advocate I don't mean pushing for your opponent to get a penalty, but a strong advocate for what you see as the truth of what happened. And as we all know, there's three sides. There's three sides to the truth. There's your truth, the opponent's truth, and what actually happened. So you may not be 100% right in what your perception is, but you want to be clear in communicating to the judge what you believe your perception of what happened is. And then they can make a judgment about what they feel they have the evidence for. But if you do not, number one, call the judge over when things happen, the extra card gets drawn, you see your opponent place an extra energy that they shouldn't have placed, cards fell on the floor, get the judge over to retrieve the cards from the floor, right? I mean, any of these things are things where you can call a judge over to help with the match. Anytime something happens that is not the proper and ordinary thing that should happen in the match, it is proper to get a judge involved in that. Explain what happened, what you feel should have happened versus what did happen, and let the judge rule. Now, this does a couple of things. Number one, it can actually catch something happening bad at that moment. Number two, it sets up a history of if that player is doing this type of behavior again and again, that bad behavior can escalate in terms of the penalties to the player. It's not just your game, it's the games throughout the tournament. But if the judge has no history and they never get called, number one, they never get called on you, or later on in round number 8, they get called over, there's no history from the rest of the tournament that in 3 other games he did this exact same thing, but nobody called the judge. The judge has nowhere to go with this because they have no history to base any harsher judgment on. So call a judge when things happen so that they can help deal with it either in that game or further on. We hear players complaining all the time about judges are not catching cheaters, but to be honest, we need your help. Help us to help you. And hopefully you found this advice helpful, and it can help you prevent being a victim of either cheating or misplays. Thanks. See you the next time.